All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a highly complex and definitely debated theory from our source material. The core idea that recent U.S. foreign policy isn't just random, chaotic flailing, but is actually a highly calculated multi front strategy. Now, if you follow international relations at all, you've probably heard a million conflicting narratives about what's really happening behind the curtain. So, we're going to map out a fascinating framework presented by the commentators in our source. It's a theory that attempts to tie together global events that, on the surface, seem completely unrelated. So the commentators make a pretty bold argument. They say that to really understand global events, we have to stop looking at them as isolated, chaotic incidents. Instead, we need to start viewing them as connected moves on a massive geopolitical chessboard. They suggest that what a lot of people perceive as massive policy failures or misadventures are, in reality, deliberate maneuvers in a much, much larger long game. It really begs the question, are we just looking at sheer geopolitical chaos out there, or is there actually a grand strategy at play? To make sense of this massive theory, we're going to follow a six-part roadmap. First, the grand strategy thesis. Second, isolating the IRGC. Third, restructuring Gulf alliances. Fourth, the global financial squeeze. Fifth, the European banking connection. And finally, number 6, a new geopolitical era. Okay, let's start with section 1, the grand strategy thesis, dismantling the old system. Now, the speakers here draw a really sharp contrast between the mainstream perception of foreign policy and their own strategic theory. In the mainstream view, you'll often hear that recent actions are just chaotic, failed interventions, right? Just one mess after another. But the strategic view from our source argues the exact opposite. They posit that these are highly calculated steps. The overarching goal, according to them, is to systematically dismantle massive global illicit funding networks that keep an old banking cartel in power. And by taking out that funding, they force a total restructuring of global alliances. Moving right along to Section 2, isolating the IRGC, the physical squeeze in the Middle East. In the Middle East theater, the source theorizes that the nation of Iran itself was actually never the true target. Instead, Iran is viewed more as a nodal point to squeeze the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC. The commentators explain that the IRGC operates on what they call a mosaic strategy. Basically, this is a highly decentralized command and control structure. And because it's a mosaic, like a giant spread-out puzzle, you literally cannot dismantle it with one single sweeping military blow. You have to take a highly methodical approach and take it apart degree by degree. To do that, the source outlines a very specific 3-step sequence. Step 1, cut off the money by blockading Iranian oil exports at critical nodes like Karg Island. Step 2, by squeezing their wallets, you force the IRGC to react, make mistakes, and cross red lines, just to defend their funding. And then, Step 3, you offer what the speakers call a golden bridge. This is essentially an opportunity for the IRGC to step aside, allowing a civilian government to actually take power and rebuild the country. The source uses a really brilliant historical analogy for this. They compare this whole strategy to Ulysses S. Grant at the end of the American Civil War. The commentators argue that, in this theory, the ultimate goal is absolutely not the destruction of Iranian civilization. Just as Grant didn't grind the Confederate army into a paste at Appomattox, the strategy aims to force a surrender that actually allows the nation to peacefully rebuild and rejoin the international community. All right, on to Section 3, restructuring Gulf alliances, the economic squeeze. Shifting our focus to the Gulf, the source points to some pretty unorthodox negotiation tactics happening right now. They highlight this incredibly bold example, a proposed 20% toll on oil coming out of the Persian Gulf. Basically, a massive fee charged for the U.S. protecting the Strait of Hormuz. Now, you'd think a threat like that would cause total panic, right? But the source claims that floating this staggering fee actually drove a massive surge in direct foreign investments from Gulf states directly into the United States. They present it as a classic hardball negotiation tactic to get regional powers to finally have some skin in the game. According to the commentators, these intense economic pressures are designed to pull the region out of those old imperial dynamics. The days of the U.S. Navy acting as the sole, endless protector of global shipping lanes, the source says those days are over. Instead, they envision a future Strait of Hormuz authority. They actually compare this to the 1936 Treaty of Montreux, which manages the Bosphorus Strait. The big idea here is to create a sovereign, self-managing authority run by the regional nations themselves. Which brings us to Section 4, the global financial squeeze, targeting the money plumbing. Now we dive into what might be the deepest, most complex layer of this entire theory, The source theorizes that there is a massive dollar pincer movement underway right now. They describe this as a highly coordinated economic strategy that is actively starving European markets of capital. By manipulating interest rates and restricting how freely dollars flow globally, this pincer movement essentially forces money to flow preferentially toward the United States, leaving Europe high and dry. And here is where it gets really interesting. The commentators argue that this pincer movement specifically leverages Japanese interest rates. See, in the past, European institutions relied on this easy financial loophole, borrowing money super cheaply in Japan to fund their investments in Europe. But as Japanese interest rates start to rise, that loophole slams shut. The source contends that this effectively cuts off Europe's access to cheap dollars, severely tightening the economic squeeze on the entire European banking system. So how does all this connect? Let's look at Section 5, the European banking connection, tying it all together. This is really the climax of the source's theory, because they connect the military conflicts in the Middle East directly to the financial stability of European banking. The source claims that global illicit operations, like the ones run by Hezbollah or the cartels in Mexico, are not just local crime problems. They argue that these entities route massive amounts of illicit funds that ultimately provide the crucial capital needed to prop up major European financial institutions. Meanwhile, the IRGC acts as the central node funding these networks, which the source claims ultimately benefits an old banking cartel centered around the City of London. To back this up, the speakers emphasize a pretty staggering statistic. They point out that a massive 70% of the Mexican banking market is actually owned by European banks. They posit that without the illicit money flowing through that huge market share, nations like Spain could face an immediate severe capital crisis. And a crisis like that wouldn't just stay in Europe. It would send shockwaves through the entire global economy. So the overarching argument here is just massive in its scope. The source suggests that military actions targeting Hezbollah and the IRGC in the Middle East, paired with crackdowns on cartels in Mexico, are actually perfectly synchronized moves. The true goal of all of this? To cut off the illicit financial lifeline flowing into Europe. By bankrupting what the commentators view as a corrupt European financial system, they essentially force Europe to concede its political and economic power. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 6, a new geopolitical era? Evaluating the endgame. So what is the ultimate endgame proposed by this highly speculative framework? Well, the commentators believe we are currently witnessing the painful birth of a completely new era. The ultimate objective of this entire multi-front strategy, they argue, is to force sincere political change globally by finally ending those extend and pretend debt cycles, the ones fueled by illicit cash and manipulated interest rates. They believe the old, entrenched bureaucratic systems will finally be dismantled. In their view, this clears the board, creating the space for genuine, sovereign nations to emerge on the world stage. As we wrap up this explainer, we want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. We've just mapped out a sweeping, complex theory connecting Middle Eastern oil blockades, Mexican banking, and Japanese interest rates into one giant synchronized strategy. But you have to ask yourself, is this multi-dimensional chess game an accurate reflection of what is actually happening in the world right now? Or is it just a geopolitical mirage, a way for us to try and find order in a world of absolute chaos? Keep that in the back of your mind the next time you see a bunch of seemingly disconnected headlines popping up on your feed. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.